At my sister's wedding, dressed in white lace and surrounded by roses, my father stood to make a toast. But instead of a blessing, he dropped a bomb. "We're selling the family company," he announced with a smirk. "Kate, you're getting nothing." The entire room erupted in laughter. My sister, my brother, the in-laws, everyone. They thought I was the family disappointment, the invisible middle child, the one who ran away to chase a pipe dream in tech. I just smiled, raised my glass and asked, "Who's buying it, Dad?" He answered with pride, "Everest Holdings. They're paying $50 million. And that's when I stood up, calm, collected, and maybe even a little amused. "I am Everest Holdings," I said. And the laughter stopped. What happened next shattered decades of favoritism, exposed embezzlement, destroyed illusions, and rebuilt an entire legacy. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you're not enough by the very people who should have supported you most, this story is for you. Because success isn't just about money. It's about showing up when no one expects you to. It's about taking everything they thought they denied you and building something they can never take back. Stay with me. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about power, family, and the moment you finally get to say, "I was never the failure. You just never saw me coming." My name is Kate Williams. I'm 42, a tech entrepreneur most people in this room wouldn't recognize even though they've known me my entire life. I didn't come here to make a scene. In fact, I almost didn't come at all. But family obligations have a way of pulling you back, especially when they're laced with guilt, performance, and something just shy of cruelty. And tonight, under the soft glow of a $1,000 chandelier at a wedding that cost more than I made my first 5 years in business, the ghosts of my past decided to perform one final act. The Williams estate had never looked more extravagant. Lush floral arrangements curled around the white trellises lining the garden. A string quartet played in the distance, their notes perfectly timed with the popping of champagne bottles. Everything about my younger sister Chloe's wedding was picture perfect. A magazine spread waiting to happen. Guests were handed monogrammed programs, waiters glided past with silver trays, and the air smelled like imported roses and generational wealth. I arrived alone. Not because I lacked invitations, but because I lacked the kind of relationships that would survive an event like this. I wore a navy blue dress, elegant, understated. Nothing that screamed for attention, though I knew better than to believe attention here wasn't always weaponized. The moment I stepped into the main garden, heads turned not out of admiration, but curiosity. Whispers followed. A few polite nods, fewer genuine smiles. A woman with a clipboard, one of the wedding planners I assumed, guided me toward the seating. "You're Miss Kate Williams, correct?" "Right this way." Her smile was tight, rehearsed. She led me to a table on the far left edge of the reception area, several feet behind the bridal family's table. From here I could see my father's face, but not hear him clearly. That wasn't an accident. Chloe's seat was at the center of everything. She looked radiant, glowing in her designer gown, arm in arm, with her new husband Kyle, whose parents I recognized from country club photos. My father, Charles Williams, stood tall and polished, beaming with pride. My mother, Eleanor, was by his side, expression soft, but unreadable. Madison. My older sister, all pearls and judgment, threw me a glance that could chip glass. It had been 10 years since we were last in the same room. Dinner passed in awkward silence. Toasts began soon after. The best man's speech was charming, if slightly predictable. Chloe giggled at all the right moments. Laughter floated above the tables like champagne bubbles. Then Charles stood up and lifted his glass. The chatter dimmed immediately. When my father spoke, everyone listened. He had the kind of presence that filled silence with authority. That's how he built Monroe Tech from a small Midwestern electronics repair shop into a multi-million-dollar empire. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," he began, voice deep and steady. "Tonight is not just a celebration of love, it's the continuation of a legacy. Chloe and Kyle, your union represents the future of this family. And speaking of the future, I have some exciting news to share." He paused dramatically. Cameras turned toward him. Every guest leaned forward. "We've officially signed the deal to sell Monroe Tech," he declared, raising his glass higher. $50 million. It's done. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People clapped. Smiles widened. Charles waited for the noise to die down before delivering the next blow. "As for inheritance, Chloe Kyle Madison, all taken care of. But Kate," he said, shifting his gaze toward my table, "you're getting nothing." It landed like a slap. Laughter echoed soft at first, then louder. My mother looked away. Madison smirked. Chloe bit her lip, avoiding my eyes. I sat still, glass in hand, heart slow but steady. I should have felt humiliated. But I didn't. Not anymore. I stood up slowly, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before I spoke. "Dad," I said, voice clear but calm, "who's buying Monroe Tech?" He chuckled. "Everest Holdings, Silicon Valley firm. They move fast. Wrote the check this morning." I nodded, raised my glass. "Then allow me to say congratulations." To myself. The silence was instant. Forks dropped. A gasp somewhere in the back. My father blinked, confused. I looked directly at him. "I am Everest Holdings." No one moved. The music had stopped, though I hadn't noticed when. My mother's lips parted in disbelief. Chloe stared at me like she'd seen a ghost. Madison looked as though she wanted to disappear into the floor. My father. His jaw clenched. Pride dissolved into confusion. Then something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. I sat back down slowly. The glass in my hand didn't shake. Let them sit with it. Let them try to understand what just happened. Let them wonder how the daughter they erased had returned not to ask for a place at the table, but to buy the damn table herself. Thank you. The silence after my announcement lingered like a fog, thick and suffocating. My father still hadn't moved. Chloe looked down at her hands. My mother's face, usually so carefully arranged, was pale and unreadable. But I didn't stand there waiting for applause. I didn't need it. I had never needed their recognition as much as I once thought I did. It hadn't always been like this. Or maybe it had, and I was simply too young to name it. Growing up in the Williams household was like living in a showroom. Everything sparkled on the outside: polished manners, pristine appearances, family portraits with perfectly coordinated outfits. But beneath the surface was a quiet calculation who fit the mold and who didn't. Madison, the eldest, was the epitome of what my parents considered successful beauty pageants, a finance degree she barely used, a husband with a last name that made headlines. Chloe, the youngest, was sweetness personified: blonde curls, doe eyes, a voice like sugar. Everyone adored Chloe. She could forget to do her chores or wreck the family car and still get a pat on the head and a warm chuckle. Then there was me. I wasn't graceful. I wasn't charming. I didn't speak when not spoken to, and I asked too many questions at the dinner table. But I was brilliant. By the time I was 10, I was tutoring 12th grade calculus. By 14, I was writing algorithms that would later be taught in Stanford lectures. My mind was my gift, and I thought it would be enough. It never was. When I was 16, I built a prototype for an inventory tracking software that could have saved Monroe Tech millions in manual labor. I remember presenting it to my father in the study one night, glowing with hope. I had printed out the mock interface, coded the back end, and even demonstrated a simulation. He didn't look up from his scotch. "Kate," he said, "don't mistake your little projects for real business. And don't think a couple of degrees will ever make you more valuable than your sisters. Life isn't about being the smartest in the room, it's about being the most useful. And frankly, I don't see where you fit." I remember nodding, swallowing the sting, then thanking him for his time. I didn't cry. I waited until the door shut behind me, then tore the simulation apart page by page. That night was a fracture, but not the first and not the last. Eleanor. My mother was always a figure of quiet elegance. She never raised her voice, never fought back. She was the kind of woman who smoothed wrinkles in linen napkins while the house burned around her. During arguments between me and my father, she would sit still, eyes lowered, hands in her lap. Once, when I confronted her asking why she never defended me, she simply said, "You're strong, Kate. Stronger than you know. You'll be fine." But I didn't want to be fine. I wanted to be seen. When I left home at 23 after another brutal dinner where I was told I was an embarrassment to the family brand, I packed a single suitcase and disappeared. No one stopped me. No one followed. A week later, I wrote a letter. Not to my father, he wouldn't have read it. I wrote to my mother. 3 pages handwritten. I told her I didn't hate her, but I couldn't understand her silence. I asked her to tell me if she'd ever loved me the way she loved Madison and Chloe. I told her I was scared but determined, and I needed to know that at least one person in the family believed in me. I never received a reply. Years later, during a business acquisition where I had to dig into old Monroe records for due diligence, I found an internal envelope marked "Private" in my mother's handwriting. It had been sealed, then torn open, and inside was my letter, creased but unread. A sticky note was attached. Burn. She hadn't just ignored me. She'd wanted my words erased. It was in that moment I realized what I had lost wasn't just a family, it was the illusion of one. They hadn't left a place for me at the table because I was never meant to be part of it. I was a placeholder, a backup, a footnote in their narrative of success. So I rewrote my story. I stopped asking to be seen and started building something they couldn't look away from. I poured my anger, my grief, and my loneliness into every line of code, every acquisition, every strategy. Not for revenge, not at first, but because it was the only place where I was in control, where no one could take credit for what I had done. And now, as I stood in that wedding hall watching my father's eyes search mine for some kind of answer, I gave him none. Because he'd taught me long ago, you don't have to explain yourself to people who've already decided you don't belong. You just have to let them watch. It wasn't just that they ignored me. It wasn't just that my mother never wrote back, or that my father dismissed every word I ever spoke as noise. The real wound came from the fact that when they finally decided to cut me off, they made sure it was public. There was no whisper behind closed doors, no quiet, awkward conversation. They waited for an audience and performed the humiliation like a well-rehearsed scene in their perfect little theater. A week after that dinner where my father told me to leave the company, I walked out of Monroe Tech with a cardboard box and a security escort. No farewell. No resistance. No acknowledgement. I wasn't escorted out because I had broken rules. I was escorted out because I was no longer considered family. They didn't just remove me from my office, they erased me from the company directory that same afternoon. I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't scream or beg. I packed what little I had left, 2 laptops, 3 notebooks, and a handful of keepsakes, and drove across state lines until the lights of the city disappeared behind me. The place I landed in wasn't glamorous. It was a detached garage behind a dilapidated duplex in a blue-collar suburb. The rent was cheap, the roof leaked in the rain, and the insulation was so poor I could see my breath every winter morning. There was a single outlet, a mattress on the floor, and a window that looked out onto a chain-link fence. But it was mine. I got a job the next day moving boxes at a distribution warehouse. Minimum wage, 12-hour shifts. Every muscle ached, but the pain was something I could control. I showed up early, kept my head down, listened to the other women talk about their kids, their second jobs, their bad knees. No one knew my last name. No one asked. At night, I came home, stripped off my boots, and opened my laptop. I studied code like my life depended on it because it did. I taught myself new languages, read case studies, rewrote entire frameworks just to understand how they worked. I survived on instant noodles and black coffee. My heater broke twice that winter, and I built a portable unit from scrap parts just to stay warm. 3 months in, I built the foundation for a platform, one that could track supply chains in real time using predictive algorithms. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to go viral. It was meant to work, something Monroe Tech's systems never truly did. I started pitching the idea to investors. They didn't laugh. They didn't listen either. One VC told me I had a strong face for a woman in logistics, but lacked the charisma to lead. Another asked if I had a male co-founder who could walk them through the pitch. I was ghosted by 5 firms in a week. Then came the con artist. A man who promised me seed capital in exchange for equity, signed the papers, smiled in photos, then pulled out just as the first server went live. I lost everything I'd scraped together. Months of code, weeks of preparation. My bank account dropped below zero. The night I realized I couldn't make rent, I stood in front of the mirror, gripping the edges of the sink like they were the only things keeping me upright. I looked awful, gaunt, dark circles under my eyes, a scar on my wrist from an old soldering accident. My reflection didn't look like a failure. It looked like someone the world had forgotten. I remember whispering something to myself. I didn't shout it. I didn't cry. I just said it with a kind of cold certainty I'd never felt before. I will build this again, and this time no one will stop me. That was the night everything changed. I started again from scratch, rewrote the entire codebase. This time I built it better, leaner, cleaner, faster. I stopped asking for permission. I stopped sending pitches to men who wouldn't take me seriously. I started forming my own shell companies, bought domains, outsourced what I couldn't handle myself. Every dollar I earned at the warehouse I reinvested. I didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even bitter. I was focused. Because sometimes when you hit the bottom hard enough, you stop reaching for the hand that pushed you there. You start climbing your way out. Quietly. With purpose. They had taken everything from me. My name, my role, my worth. But they'd made one mistake. They underestimated what an invisible child could become when no one was watching. It didn't happen overnight. Revenge. Real revenge isn't loud. It doesn't come wrapped in flames or fury. It comes slowly like fog rolling in through a valley unnoticed until everything is blanketed. That's how I built Everest Holdings quietly, relentlessly, under a name no one connected to the girl who once mopped warehouse floors just to keep the lights on. I didn't want them to see me coming. I didn't want the credit. I wanted control. The name came first. Eliza Stone. It wasn't just a pseudonym. It was armor. Eliza sounded sharp, assertive. Stone felt immovable. That was the version of myself I needed to be harder, colder, untouchable. I registered the name through a Delaware holding firm and built a paper trail so clean, so seamless, even the IRS wouldn't find Kate Williams buried under it. The first hire was a lawyer. Not a cheap one. I used everything I had to retain someone who specialized in anonymity, offshore protections, and high-stakes acquisitions. He never asked who I really was. He was paid to protect a name, not a person. Through him, I set up a trust. The trust owned the firm. The firm owned the assets. And I stayed out of the light. Everest Holdings didn't announce itself with press releases or grand openings. It slipped quietly into the bloodstream of the logistics and tech market. I didn't start by buying anything glamorous. I started with what my father would have called invisible infrastructure warehouses, transport lines, packaging plants. The bones of the operation. The parts no one paid attention to, but that held the entire supply chain together. I knew Monroe Tech's weaknesses. I had lived inside them. I'd seen how sloppy their procurement systems were, how slow their software was to adapt. So I started buying their suppliers. Not directly, not all at once. I'd take small stakes through third-party investment arms, then more, then controlling interest. I'd replace outdated systems with my own technology, automation, predictive tracking, seamless integration. All of it labeled Everest Innovation Suite, and none of it linked to my name. Monroe Tech didn't notice. If anything, their executives were relieved. Costs were dropping. Timelines were improving. They toasted themselves for strong vendor relationships, never realizing they were slowly becoming dependent on me. By the time I had full operational leverage on 3 of their 5 major fulfillment hubs, I started moving upward into enterprise software, cybersecurity, logistics, analytics. I had no interest in becoming a Silicon Valley darling. I had interest in leverage, influence, positioning myself in a place where I could make decisions before Monroe even knew those decisions existed. The real test came when I pitched Everest's systems to a Fortune 100 client Monroe had been chasing for years. They signed with me in 36 hours. That deal alone put Everest on the map not in headlines, but in the internal memos of every major operations director in the region. Behind closed doors, Everest Holdings was becoming a name that made people pay attention. And still no one knew it was me. Not the boardroom sharks I negotiated with. Not the old mentors who'd refused to return my calls years earlier. Not even the tech blogs who speculated about Eliza Stone wondering if she was real or just a brand front for a private equity consortium. I liked it that way. Staying hidden gave me power I'd never had when I bore the name Kate Williams. Kate was dismissed, overlooked, spoken over at family dinners. Kate asked for respect and got laughter in return. But Eliza didn't ask. She signed contracts. She terminated deals. She didn't explain herself. Eventually, I began acquiring companies with ties to Monroe's R&D pipeline startups that Monroe depended on for future innovation. I didn't steal them. I bought them legally, ethically, with better offers. Some founders didn't even realize they were walking away from deals with Monroe until the ink dried. One night, after locking in a merger that made Everest the largest logistics intelligence platform in our quadrant, I sat alone in my garage, still the same one, though now renovated, climate-controlled, and unrecognizable. I looked at the original blueprint I'd once sketched on napkins and cardboard scraps. I traced the lines with my fingers. I remembered the girl who'd stood in front of that cracked mirror whispering that she'd rebuild. And she had. She just wasn't Kate anymore. She was Eliza Stone now, and Monroe Tech. They were standing on a trap door and didn't even know it. There's something uniquely satisfying about watching the walls of an empire bend without anyone inside realizing the ground is shifting. That's how I approached Monroe Tech, not with headlines or lawsuits, but with precision, quiet influence and an army of shadows. My family had stripped me of a seat at their table, so I built a bigger table. Then I bought their chairs. After Everest Holdings had solidified its presence in logistics and predictive analytics, I began Phase 2. It started with targeted acquisitions, each one carefully selected to weave around Monroe Tech's operations without drawing attention. Through shell companies and holding firms, I acquired interests in Monroe's regional distribution networks, their preferred software vendors, and even their outsourced customer service center. By the time I was done, I didn't just own services Monroe depended on, I controlled them. 42% of Monroe's operational assets were under my indirect ownership. They thought they were dealing with 10 different companies. In reality, they were all branches of one hand, and that hand was mine. Kyle Anderson, my sister Chloe's husband, was the ideal entry point. Newly married into the family, eager to prove himself, and embarrassingly careless with due diligence. Kyle had recently been promoted to Monroe's Strategic Partnerships team, a title he wore like a trophy but treated like a side hustle. He was the one signing most of the vendor contracts with Everest Holdings and its affiliates, believing he was scoring exclusive deals that would impress my father. He had no idea those contracts were landing on desks I personally approved. At first, I let it play out. Let him enjoy the pats on the back, the bonuses he didn't deserve. It gave me access to everything: supplier data, pricing models, long-term forecasting reports. But then his emails started shifting. He began requesting side adjustments on pricing structures. He wanted a percentage of discounts funneled into advisory fees paid to a consulting firm under his name. I don't tolerate amateurs, especially not ones who marry into a family that once exiled me. I instructed my legal team to approve the adjusted contracts while simultaneously embedding a forensic accountant into the next financial audit Monroe had scheduled. She wasn't listed as Everest's employee. She was presented as a neutral third-party consultant, a favor offered by one of our investment partners. My father, never one to turn down free expertise, welcomed her without hesitation. Within weeks, she uncovered everything. Kyle had been skimming money from multiple vendor agreements. He had routed payments through an offshore account in Belize, hidden behind layers of shell entities registered in his college roommate's name. The accountant compiled a 97-page dossier complete with transaction logs, internal memos, and falsified expense reports. I didn't use it right away. You don't play your best card in the middle of the game. You wait. You watch. You make sure when it lands, it burns everything it touches. Instead, I kept feeding Kyle more rope, more exclusive deals, bigger advisory fees. I wanted the paper trail to be undeniable. I wanted my father to see with perfect clarity the man he had chosen over me for his youngest daughter, the man he toasted at every dinner, the man he trusted with his company's future. Every signature Kyle placed was another nail in the coffin, and every nail was hammered in by his own hand. As the months passed, Monroe Tech began leaning more and more on Everest Holdings to stay competitive. Their internal systems hadn't evolved in years, and my technologies made them look cutting edge without requiring actual innovation. Their competitors couldn't figure out how Monroe had suddenly become faster, leaner, more efficient. They didn't know the answer was me. One afternoon, sitting alone in my office, I stared at the network map that displayed every entity tied to Monroe's operations. 82 nodes, 47 marked in green mine. My legal team had just sent over the finalized documents showing I now held controlling interest in two of Monroe's primary logistics providers. I took a breath and stared out the window. They were standing on scaffolding I had built. If I pulled one lever, the entire structure would tilt in my direction. But I wasn't ready to tilt it. Not yet. First, I wanted them to smile. I wanted them to celebrate. I wanted them to think they had won. And when the fall came, I wanted it to feel like it came out of nowhere. I closed the dossier on Kyle and slipped it into a locked drawer. Not because I was finished, but because I was only just beginning. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. Heavy paper, cream-colored with embossed lettering and gold trim. Elegant. Expensive. Just like everything Chloe touched. My name was printed on the front. No dear, no warmth. Just Kate Williams in stiff calligraphy. I opened it slowly, expecting some performance of reconciliation, some dramatic flourish meant to suggest time had healed what it hadn't. Inside was the wedding invitation. Chloe Marie Williams and Kyle Anderson request the honor of your presence. At their wedding ceremony. It was the kind of language that screamed politeness without meaning it. Tucked beneath the invitation was a smaller card hand-signed in ink that looked rushed. It read, "You're welcome to attend the ceremony. Seating is limited for dinner, so we hope you understand." I didn't need translation. That was Chloe's way of saying, you're not part of the inner circle, not family, not honored, just tolerated. A name checked off a list because the optics required it. I placed the card on the desk and sat in silence. A dozen thoughts flickered through my mind. I hadn't spoken to Chloe in years. The last time we were in the same room, she made a joke about people who peak in high school and looked directly at me. And now she wanted me at her wedding, not in celebration, but as an extra in her picture-perfect moment. My first instinct was to throw the invitation out. Let them think I was too proud, too wounded to show up. Let them keep their stories clean. But that night, while reviewing a late-stage merger involving Monroe Tech and a European defense contractor, something caught my eye. A footnote in a legal memo. One sentence. Pending final board vote on proposed equity sale to private buyer. A private buyer. $50 million. Listed with Everest Holdings as the advisory firm. I called my legal advisor at once. He confirmed what I suspected. My father was preparing to sell Monroe Tech, finally cashing out after decades of empire building. The board had given conditional approval. All that remained was the final public announcement, and the deal was set to be revealed at the wedding. Suddenly, the invitation wasn't a formality. It was an opportunity. I stared at the card again, this time not with bitterness, but calculation. I thought about the smile on my father's face when he'd make his toast. The certainty in his voice when he would announce the sale, believing his legacy was secure and that I had been erased from it. I thought about how satisfying it would be to dismantle that illusion, not with rage, not with noise, but with undeniable fact. So I RSVP'd. I instructed my attorney to assemble every legal document we had: the acquisition contracts, the vendor agreements, the binding memorandums of understanding that proved Everest Holdings already had operational control over nearly half of Monroe Tech's assets. We reviewed the signed commitments from the board. I highlighted the clause giving Everest veto power in the event of any restructuring. Then I called my assistant. "I want a contingency team on standby," I said. "Media social analysts, a publicist, and someone who can stream from their phone without drawing attention. If we need to go public, I want to control the narrative within 60 seconds. She didn't hesitate. Done. For weeks I prepared in silence. Not just for an appearance, but for a reckoning. My wardrobe was selected with intention. Understated, elegant, strong. I wasn't going to show up looking like someone they pitied. I was going to look like the person they had no idea I'd become. On the morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror. My reflection didn't flinch. I thought about the girl in the garage, cold and shaking. I thought about the warehouse floors and the broken contracts. And I thought about the silence my mother had given me when I begged to be seen. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming a story they had tried to write without me. I slipped the folder of documents into my bag, checked my phone for updates from legal, and walked out the door. Let them smile. Let them toast. They had no idea who they just invited into the room. The morning of the wedding was overcast, the kind of gray that hinted at rain but never delivered. I arrived early not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to watch. To study the faces, to take note of who smiled too wide and who watched too closely. The venue was exactly what I expected: lavish, excessive, curated down to the last imported flower petal. Chloe had spared no expense. Crystal chandeliers hung from the temporary pavilion, and the champagne flowed even before the ceremony began. No one in my family had any idea that the woman standing near the cocktail bar sipping Perrier and speaking politely to strangers was the CEO of the very company their futures now depended on. I was still Kate to them, the forgotten daughter, the outsider who hadn't earned her seat. But behind the scenes, every vendor they'd contracted, every logistical partner involved in the event, even the security had been cleared through Everest Holdings. Through me. Chloe approached me mid-morning. Her smile was soft, but her eyes twitched at the edges. Her hands, always so perfectly manicured, were clenched at her sides. "I'm glad you came," she said. The words were practiced. "Dad didn't think you would." I nodded. Neither did I. She looked like she wanted to say more, but stopped herself. Then almost too quickly she added, "Please don't make today about you." It wasn't a request. It was a warning. I studied her face. The smile faltered for a moment, just long enough for me to wonder. Did she know? Had someone told her? Or was it just the weight of my presence that unsettled her? Before I could press further, our mother swept in. Eleanor was a vision in navy satin hair pinned high, her posture more rigid than usual. She stood between us like a curtain drawn across a stage. "Kate," she said, voice low but firm, "this is not the time for drama. I know you enjoy being different, but this is your sister's day. Try not to embarrass us. Embarrass them." That had always been the fear, hadn't it? Not that I'd fail, but that I'd fail publicly. Or worse, succeed in ways they couldn't explain. I said nothing, just smiled and stepped back. But the seed was planted. Chloe's nervousness, Eleanor's control. Something wasn't right. Later, while I stood near the back patio to take a call from my assistant confirming the media team was in position if needed, I heard a familiar voice. "Is that really Kate Williams?" I turned to see Lena Foster approaching, heels clicking against the stone path. She wore tailored white slacks, sunglasses perched in her hair, and the kind of quiet confidence only venture capital could afford. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Stanford. But I knew she held a 2% equity share in Everest. A legacy position I'd allowed out of respect for her early belief in the product, long before I had power to reward or punish loyalty. "Lena," I said. "You wear Eliza well," she replied, smiling. "It's almost like Kate never existed." The words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She leaned in slightly. "You know they're circling right? The investors. They're happy now, of course. Profits speak louder than people. But once Monroe is absorbed, the question becomes, who's holding the steering wheel?" I met her gaze. "I am." Lena tilted her head. "Just remember, ghost or not, even shadows have enemies, and some of them wear your name." Then she walked away, leaving the scent of perfume and power behind her. I stood still for a moment, the noise of the party folding around me. The message was clear. Chloe may not have known who I really was, but someone did. Maybe more than one. And they weren't just watching, they were waiting. This wasn't just a family reckoning. This was the beginning of a larger war. And I would fight it with the same silence I'd used to build everything, until it was time to speak. The reception hall shimmered under a canopy of gold light. Glass clinked. Laughter swirled between centerpieces and champagne towers. Somewhere the band began to tune up for the father-daughter dance. But something in the air shifted the moment Charles Williams stood from his chair at the head table. His expression was smug, commanding, even proud. A man about to deliver a grand finale. He held his glass with that same rehearsed charm he'd used at board meetings, birthdays, and branding campaigns. "I want to thank you all for being here today," he began, voice booming through the microphone. "A day to celebrate love, of course, but also legacy." Chloe, radiant in her wedding gown, reached for Kyle's hand. Madison leaned in with her trademark smirk. Eleanor didn't look up. Her gaze was fixed on the linen folds in her lap. "As many of you know," Charles continued, "our family business. Monroe Tech has been my life's work. And now, after long consideration, I've decided to begin a new chapter." He paused dramatically, letting the silence draw tension. "I've sold Monroe Tech." Gasps rippled across the room, but Charles smiled through them like a magician unveiling the trick he'd been hiding in his sleeve. "To Everest Holdings," he said proudly, $50 million, a new future for the company, and for the family." Polite applause broke out. Chloe clapped daintily. Madison gave a slow nod of approval, whispering something to her husband that made them both laugh under their breath. Then came the punch. Kate, Charles said, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on me. "I know you're here. I thought it was best to say this plainly. You'll be receiving nothing." Dead silence. Even the waitstaff froze. His voice was calm, but surgical. "I made this decision not out of malice, but clarity. You've chosen your path, and the family has chosen theirs. Let's consider this clean." I stood slowly, my napkin falling from my lap. "I see," I said softly. All eyes turned. I could feel the room tighten. Whispers darted like insects through the air. My fingers closed around the stem of my glass as I walked toward the center of the hall. "You said you sold Monroe Tech to Everest Holdings," I repeated. Charles nodded, sensing a challenge. "I did. You were never involved, so I don't expect you to understand the details." I raised my glass. "No, Father. I understand perfectly." And then I looked straight at him. "I am Everest Holdings." The words dropped like stones into water. The room didn't gasp. It stopped. Breathing halted. Time fractured. Then came the murmurs. Then came the chaos. Chloe's face went white. Madison dropped her glass. Eleanor closed her eyes but didn't lift her head. Charles blinked once. Twice. "What did you say?" I said. I repeated louder this time. "You just sold your entire company to me." "No," he snapped. "That's not possible. I negotiated with their CEO, Eliza Stone." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a folder. Thick. Embossed. Legal. Eliza Stone. I said as a name I created to build something you never believed I could. Gasps again. Phones were coming out. People were filming. You didn't vet your buyer. You didn't look past the paperwork. You were so eager to get me out you never imagined I'd be the one holding the pen. Charles was shaking now. This deal isn't binding. I'll revoke it. I turned to the back of the room. A tall man in a dark suit stepped forward carrying a leather briefcase. My attorney. This is Philip Graves, I said clearly. He's Everest Holdings senior counsel. He's here today to verify that the board has not only approved the sale but finalized it. Every document has been reviewed, signed, and filed with the SEC. Graves opened the briefcase and produced the final paperwork stamped, sealed, and indisputable. Charles stepped back. You tricked me. No, I said. You dismissed me. The guests were whispering now, cameras flashing the news already spreading through the room like wildfire. Chloe looked like she wanted to disappear. Madison sat frozen. Eleanor finally looked up, but her face held no expression. You said I'd get nothing, I told him. I raised my glass again. But now I own everything. The silence hadn't yet settled when I raised my hand once more. The air was still buzzing from my announcement. Me, the invisible daughter, now the owner of everything. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Before this evening ends, I said, my voice steady, there's one more matter to address. A matter of ethics. Of theft. The guests murmured again, some turning toward the head table, others pulling their phones closer to their chests. Charles was still frozen, fists clenched. Chloe stared into her lap. Kyle had paled 2 full shades, shifting in his chair like he already sensed the noose tightening. I pulled out a smaller folder, this one sleek and marked confidential. This, I said, is a financial dossier compiled during a scheduled audit of Monroe Tech's third-party contracts. It contains evidence of misappropriation of company funds, bribes, side deals, shell accounts offshore, all orchestrated by one man. I didn't point. I didn't need to. Kyle's face drained of all color. Over the past 18 months, I continued. Kyle Anderson has diverted over $2 million through fictitious consulting agreements, unauthorized vendor fees, and forged expense reimbursements. Gasps. Some stood up. A wine glass shattered somewhere to my left. Kyle jumped up from his seat. This is insane, she's making this up. I nodded toward the back of the room. My attorney walked forward again, this time with 2 uniformed auditors behind him. One of them held a laptop. He clicked once, and the main screen behind the couple's table flickered to life. A series of email chains, payment trails, and spreadsheet snapshots flashed across the screen. Names, amounts, wire instructions. No one spoke. I turned back to Kyle. You have 2 options, I said. You can resign from any current affiliation with Monroe Holdings, surrender the stolen assets, and issue a public apology, or we turn this over to the district attorney tomorrow morning. He looked to Chloe, wild-eyed. Say something, do something. But Chloe wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me. I knew she whispered. The words barely escaped her lips, but they sliced through the noise like a blade. I tilted my head slightly. What did you say? Chloe stood. Her voice cracked. I knew it was you. Weeks ago. I saw a memo on Kyle's desk, an Everest signature I recognized. I put it together. I knew you were Eliza Stone. But I didn't say anything. Why? Madison hissed beside her, already pushing her chair back. Chloe swallowed. Her eyes filled with tears, but not for Kyle. Because I was jealous. I spent my life being the favorite, the pretty one, the chosen one. But you built something I couldn't compete with. And I hated that. I let the silence sit, let the moment sting. Madison stood abruptly, fury boiling in her voice. This is pathetic, she spat. All of you. You let Dad turn this family into a contest, and we all played along. Charles tried to speak, but she cut him off. No, you don't get to talk, she snapped. You pitted us against each other our whole lives. Kate was never the problem. You were. With that, Madison grabbed her purse and stormed out. Guests shifted nervously. Some followed her. Others sat rigid, unsure what to do. Chloe looked at Kyle one last time. "We're done." Kyle tried to speak again, but this time no one listened. My attorney approached him quietly, offering a slim envelope with 2 forms, resignation and restitution. Kyle's hands shook as he took it. I didn't press charges. Not because I couldn't, but because punishment was already unraveling all around him. He would lose the money, the power, the image, and Chloe. As for my father, he had yet to say a word. He stood there, shoulders drawn, jaw set, his empire gone, his legacy sold, his secrets exposed, his daughters divided, his control shattered. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat. I simply turned toward him and said calmly, "You taught me to win. You just never taught me what to do when I did." Then I walked back to my table, and I sat down. Not as a guest, not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman they could no longer ignore. I should have known the war wasn't over. The room was still reeling from Kyle's downfall, from Chloe's confession, from Madison's dramatic exit. But even as I sat at my table sipping a now warm glass of champagne, I felt an unease coiling in my gut. The kind that doesn't come from victory, but from instinct. Something wasn't right. Back at my hotel suite later that night, I opened my laptop and reviewed the transaction records one more time. Every contract, every signature, every amendment to the Everest Monroe acquisition. The deal was airtight, or at least it had been. Then I found it, buried deep in a digital folder, an unsigned draft I hadn't authored, but that bore the Everest Holdings header was a revised clause in the governance agreement. It read like legal noise unless you knew what to look for: a conditional voting restriction. It stated that in the event of a board conflict initiated by any director holding more than 40% of assets, that member's vote would be suspended pending arbitration. In plain terms, if I ever challenged a board decision publicly, I'd lose my vote. My power. I froze. I hadn't approved this clause, nor had the official board voted on it. I scanned the document's metadata. Last editor Lena Foster. Timestamp 3 days before the final signature date. Suddenly her words from the wedding rang louder in my head. Even shadows have enemies. She knew I'd win, and she had planned for what came after. The next file confirmed it. An internal memo between Lena and Charles. Yes, Charles. Outlining a contingency plan to slowly shift control back to original stakeholders once the sale was complete. Their strategy relied on me believing I had won, while they quietly maneuvered behind the scenes to box me out using my own legal structure. And then, I saw the mistake. The memo referenced a version of the contract that was never filed. Charles had sent the wrong one. The board had signed off on the earlier draft, my version. No hidden clauses, no trapdoor. The mistake was stupid, human. But it was enough. Within an hour, I had my legal team on a secure call. I presented the evidence, the timeline, the metadata, and the paper trail. Every message Lena had exchanged with Charles. Every draft they tampered with. "We need to act now," I told them, before they realized their version didn't go through. We called an emergency board meeting. The next morning, Everest Holdings directors gathered via encrypted conference. Lena dialed in from New York, her tone breezy, until she saw who else was on the call. Charles joined, too clearly confident, dressed like a man ready to reclaim his throne. I let them speak first. I watched Lena glide through corporate jargon praising the smoothness of the Monroe acquisition. Charles even offered to stay on in an advisory role, suggesting his experience would be invaluable in integrating the two firms. When they were done, I shared my screen, and I dropped the hammer. I displayed the altered draft, then the metadata, then the internal memo. I zoomed in on the timestamp of Charles's mistaken email. "You sold me Monroe Tech," I said calmly, "but you tried to poison the well before the ink dried." Lena was silent. Charles tried to sputter a denial, but the evidence spoke louder than his panic. My lead counsel addressed the board next. "These are clear grounds for breach of fiduciary duty and attempted fraudulent interference with shareholder governance." A vote was held, swift, unanimous. Lena was removed from Everest Holdings board immediately. Her equity position converted to silent shares with no voting power. Charles was issued a formal cease and desist. Any involvement in future negotiations, contracts, or branding under the Monroe name was permanently barred. He was finished. They had tried to build a back door. I tore it off its hinges. When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. Not in relief, in clarity. They had seen me coming, and I still beat them. It was a quiet afternoon when Eleanor asked to see me. No grand setting, no audience. Just a modest bench beneath the sycamore tree outside the old church where Chloe had once sung in a children's choir. The same tree I'd once read under while waiting for rides, no one came to give. She sat before I did, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time in decades, she looked older than I remembered, not worn by age but by the weight of silence. "I won't waste your time," she began, her voice soft but unshaking. "I know what I was, what I let happen." I said nothing. Let her speak. "When you left," she continued, "you wrote to me. That letter. I kept it." I turned my head, slightly unsure what surprised me more, the admission or the fact that she remembered every word. I didn't respond because I was afraid, she said. "Not of you. Of what it would mean to open that door, to let you fail again and watch it happen all over." I swallowed hard. Even now, after everything, the wound knew how to ache. I told myself it was protection, she added, blinking back something I wasn't sure she'd let fall. But it was cowardice, the kind that cloaks itself in motherhood but serves no one. I waited, the wind nudging between us. "I didn't believe in you." She said the words so quiet they almost vanished. "And now I see I was the one who failed." Still, I said nothing. "I know you don't owe me forgiveness," she continued. "And I'm not asking for it. I just needed you to know." I looked at her then, really looked. And I saw not just my mother, but the woman who'd once stood by while others decided my worth. The woman who chose comfort over courage. "I don't need you to be sorry," I finally said. "I just need you to remember this. I was never a failure. Not even then." Her breath caught in her chest, but she nodded. It was all she could do, and all I needed. Later that week, Chloe came by my office. She didn't schedule a meeting, didn't come with a publicist or a practiced line. Just a simple knock, and then her face through the glass, stripped of makeup, eyes tired, voice raw. "I don't know what to say," she said when I let her in. "Try the truth," I replied. She sat down across from me, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "I was awful to you. Not just at the wedding. For years. I let envy turn me into something small." I didn't respond. She continued. "I want to fix it. Or try to. I know I can't just walk back into your life like nothing happened. But if you ever need someone, or if there's anything I can do," I slid a folder across the table. She opened it, puzzled. "A temporary analyst position," I said. 6-month trial. Entry level. No special treatment. You'll report to a team lead, someone who doesn't know your last name." Her eyes widened. "You'd let me work for you?" "No," I said. "You'll work for Everest. If you're good enough, the company will keep you. If not, you'll go like anyone else." She didn't cry. She just nodded quietly, and for the first time in her life, she didn't expect applause for it. As she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Kate," she said, turning back. "Thank you for not slamming the door." I held her gaze. "I didn't leave it open for you. I left it open for what you might become." She left without another word. And I was alone again, but not abandoned. This time, it was on my own terms. The office was quiet. No hum of voices, no ringing phones, just the soft whisper of wind moving through the partially open window. Beyond the glass, the Boston harbor stretched out like silver beneath a low sun. Ships glided slowly, and the ocean air carried that particular chill that only came just before fall. Kate sat in the chair by the window. Not behind the desk, not today. She didn't need the desk to prove she belonged anymore. The wood-paneled walls around her were new, but the silence they held felt familiar. It reminded her of another silence years ago when she'd sat in the garage apartment, hands frozen from the lack of heat, heart burning from humiliation. The day her father had told her she wasn't welcome, that her ideas were foolish, that her education, her voice, her presence meant nothing. She had held on to that moment for a long time, not out of bitterness, out of precision, out of memory, the kind that doesn't weigh you down but keeps you sharp. In the months since the wedding, everything had changed. Everest Holdings wasn't just her company now, it was a force. A name whispered in every corner of the tech world, in boardrooms where once only men who spoke her father's language were allowed. The Monroe name had become a line item under a larger structure. No longer his empire. No longer his to weaponize. She turned her gaze from the ocean to the table in the center of her office. A conference table, sleek, dark, modern. 10 chairs surrounded it. 9 were empty. Later that afternoon, a new group of department heads would take their places there. Leaders Kate had chosen. Some young, some older. One of them was Chloe. She had been on time every day since starting her trial. Polite, quiet, learning. Kate didn't favor her, didn't protect her. She offered no shortcuts. Because now she knew fairness didn't mean softness. It meant clarity, boundaries, truth. A knock came at the door. Her assistant poked her head in. "Boardroom's ready when you are." Kate nodded once. 5 minutes. When the door closed, she walked to her desk and opened the drawer where she kept only one thing, the letter she had written to her mother all those years ago. The one Eleanor never answered. She didn't reread it. She didn't need to. Just knowing it was there unopened for so long had once felt like abandonment. Now it felt like proof. Proof that she'd built it all without needing to be saved. She placed the letter back in the drawer, shut it gently, then turned to face the room. This place, this office, this tower, this name, none of it was about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the story. Kate straightened her shoulders, crossed the room, and placed her hand on the boardroom door. She paused, not out of hesitation, but to remember. To remember the girl who sat at the kids' table during family dinners while her siblings toasted champagne with their father. To remember the hallway seat at Chloe's engagement party. To remember every time someone said she wasn't enough. She opened the door. One by one, the team began to rise as she entered, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of earned respect. Kate took her seat at the head of the table. She didn't need validation anymore. She didn't need them to say sorry. She didn't need their applause. She had something better. Control, legacy, truth. And as the meeting began, she allowed herself just one final thought, quiet, cold, and crystal clear. I didn't come here to take revenge. I came to reclaim the seat they refused to give me. The story you just heard isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming a place that was denied, about rising through silence, not spite. Kate didn't need fire or fury to get even. She used precision, resilience, and truth. And in the end, that was more powerful than anything her family ever expected. How many of us have been overlooked, underestimated, or cast aside by the very people who should have lifted us up? Kate's story is for every silent fighter. For every person told they weren't enough. For everyone who sat at the edge of the room while others took the spotlight. If this story struck something deep within you, if it made you feel seen, vindicated, or even just quietly empowered, then we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. What would you say if you finally had the chance to sit at the table they never let you near? And don't forget to subscribe. Because this isn't the last story we'll tell about those who rise from the ashes and rebuild the fire themselves.